There was an old man, all alone in his mechanical fortress, save for the green-haired puppet child. But there were days when he regretted even that small comfort. He scowled angrily at the people through his mirrors, as they continued obliviously with their happy little existence. His only comfort was the sadness of a little duck and her nightly lover, and that of the prince's bride, the girl who still carried traces of raven blood in her veins. It was all just so unfair. After all these years of waiting for his chance to finish his story as tragically as possible, and yet there was hardly a sad face in the village, his village. Once again he resumed pacing his extensive fortress, muttering angrily under his breath. "Traitorous boy," he snarled, glaring at the knight who had inherited his powers. "It was my story, not yours. If you wanted something happier, you should have just gone and written something yourself." The boy could not hear him, though. Ever since the knight broke the machine that the old man had built to continue writing his story, he could not contact anyone within the village boundaries without being called on first. He was as helpless as, a duck. "Are you mad, Zuria?" the puppet asked while beating her little drum lightly. He sighed angrily as he moved into a tiny study that he had tucked away into a corner of his fortress. "Of course I am, Zuria," he barked at the puppet, kicking life-size mannequins out of the way so that he could collapse across the tacky orange couch. "Now what?" he muttered as he stared at the shelves of books. The living doll shrugged, sat herself next to him, and continued playing with her drum. The old man sighed, taking her toy away and chucking it over one shoulder. "Will you stop with that thing, Zuria? I have been listening to it for nearly 5 years." She pouted a little, and took out a bit of string to start making a cat's cradle with. Drosselmeyer stared at the red thread between the girl's hands for a second, as his mind shuddered violently. Without warning, his eyes trailed to one high and dusty corner, one that saw rarely any light. The large golden orbs widened, and he hurriedly hopped to his feet, so that he could push the ladder into the corner and climb up it. Once he had reached his destination, his large gloved hand shot out, and grabbed an old book with decades of dust on the faded leather cover. He blew on it to send a cloud of dust flying through the air. Then he took the end of his long red cape to rub vigorously on the golden letters of the title. "What you doin', Zuria?" Zuria asked him curiously, but her question remained unanswered. He couldn't be bothered with her right now. Sighing happily, the old man slid down the ladder and propped himself into the orange couch again. He opened the book and began reading. Shrugging, the puppet hopped into his lap and silently read the story as well. Before half the story was read, she sighed in a depressed manner. "This is a sad story, Zuria." "Exactly," the man answered happily, letting his first piece return to him in its full glory. Now this was a good tragedy. Those critics couldn't have possibly known what they were talking about. Now more than ever, he regretted replacing the story with the prince and the raven. He sighed again. Once he had finished reading the first story he had ever written. "I wonder whatever happened to him," he whispered to himself, holding the book to his chest. Suddenly, his heart rate began to increase, a brilliant idea beginning to blossom in his mind. Praying that it wasn't too late, he ran back to the main part of his mechanical fortress and forced the looking glass to focus on a place that was far from Kincan village. His smile almost became grotesque at what he saw. A young woman was sitting by her mother's deathbed in a cold and sterile hospital. Promise me you'll do it," the skeletal woman gasped, one bony hand clinging to her daughter's slim one. The beautiful brunette's eyes were pained as she leaned over to the woman and kissed her brow. "I promise," she whispered in a hoarse voice. "I will finish what my father started." The older woman sighed in gratitude, leaned her head against the pillow, and died. Her daughter began shaking uncontrollably and gently laid her head over her mother's abdomen to start crying, a terrible choking sob that could melt the hardest of hearts. "Wonderful, just wonderful!" Drosselmeyer gloated, before adjusting his mirror so that he could get a brief summary of everything that had happened to her
since the last time he'd seen the girl child. What he saw was more than enough to brighten his morbid mood.
She went and did it, he gawked, falling out of his rocking chair in order to laugh uproariously.
She really did fall in love with a cat, an immortal one at that. Oh, this is so delicious. Thank you, my dear, he said gloatingly to the sobbing brunette, although she couldn't hear him. I knew I could count on you to give me a good tragedy. Well, don't you fret, my pretty. This time there will be no critics to make me forget about you. Come, Eusuria, he commanded, jumping out of his seat. Hurriedly, he returned to his study and fetched out the spare paper and ink that he always kept for emergencies, so that he could slam them on his table and pull up a chair. With inspiration he hadn't felt since he was alive, he began writing. It wouldn't be able to do as much as if he were alive, but it would give his first story the nudge it needed to become real once more. What are you going to do, Zuria? The puppet asked curiously. Isn't it obvious? I'm going to make sure that her story ends the way it should be. You were always my favorite, Precious,
he whispered to the girl in the mirror,
as his quill danced across the inky parchment into the spidery scrolls. I know you'll give me the tragedy that I deserve. Once upon a time, there was a little princess. From her earliest memory, she was the apple of her mother's eye. But her father treated her like a stranger, often forgetting her real name when he remembered that she existed. The little princess did everything she could to win his affection.
But alas, he was never moved by her extensive efforts.
Finally, in desperation, the princess begged her father to tell her what she could do to make him love her. The king thought carefully on this, for although he did not care about the girl, his soul was too sincere to tell her what he did not and could not feel. In hopes that she would give him up and leave him in peace, he told his young daughter that if she became the greatest ballet dancer the world has ever seen, he would love her. The princess wasted no time in doubling her efforts in dance, and soon excelled above those who were in her age group. She practiced at the point of exhaustion every day, and often had injuries from going too far, which worried her mother terribly. The queen begged her husband to tell their daughter just once that he was proud of her, that he loved her, but he couldn't speak what he did not feel, even for his beloved wife, whose heart slowly turned cold against him for his treatment of the princess. The girl kept dancing throughout the years, and won much honor and fame for her unusual techniques. But still, her father kept silent, knowing that it would never be enough to awaken love for his only child. But then, one day, when the young princess was 16 years old, her father was out traveling, trying to recover a family treasure that was stolen while his daughter was just a baby. His enemy, delighted on seeing him alone, had ordered his maids to slaughter the king while he was alone in their clutches. The father fought bravely, but in the end, he fell under their swords.
His daughter was devastated by his death,
and for the love that she knew would never come. In sorrow, she took her ballet shoes, her medals, and all her possessions that were related to dancing, and put them in a box far from her eyes. Although she loved ballet with all her heart, she swore that day that she would never dance again,
for it reminded her too much of what would forever be denied to her. For 1 whole year she kept her word. She lost her natural grace, what little there was of her confidence, until she was but a shadow of a person she once was, and no one would have ever believed her to have once been a great dancer. On the anniversary of her father's death, she was asked to break her vow by one who didn't know her terrible pain she could not even talk about to her beloved mother. The princess tried to say no at first, but in the year to come she would be grateful that she had consented to dance once again, for in time it would open a door to what she believed would be happiness at last.